Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the IISS. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Research Associate for Transnational Threats here at the Institute. I'm very pleased to see many familiar faces, some new ones in the audience. Today we are here to discuss the impact of organized crime on development and governance in Africa. Only a few years ago, hosting an event on this topic at the IISS, or indeed running a research project on organized crime, would have been very unlikely. Of course, we would have looked at, for instance, the opium trade as one of the many components of the conflict in Afghanistan, but we would not have devoted a whole session on organized crime. Well, things have changed. The realization that some forms of organized crime have such a deep impact on development, security, and governance of vulnerable states in the developing world prompt us to embark on more in-depth work, hence the Adelphi book we produced last year, together with a number of shorter pieces and seminars. A similar realization is what gave former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan the impetus to establish the West Africa Commission on the Impact of Drugs on Governance, Security and Development in January this year. The Commission, chaired by former Nigerian President Obasanjo, consists of a number of African personalities and also benefits from international advisors, two of whom are here with us today, Professor Stephen Ellis and Ms. Camino Kavanagh, soon to be Dr. Kavanagh. Well, Professor Ellis is the Desmond Tutu Professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Wood University in Amsterdam and a senior researcher at the Africa Studies Center in Leiden. In the past, he has worked at Africa Confidential and for the African Affairs journals. Prior to that, he was the director of the Africa Program at the International Crisis Group, and throughout his career, he has served as a consultant for various governments in Europe, in Africa, and for the United Nations. Ms. Kavanagh is a senior fellow at the Center on International Cooperation at the New York University, and is currently the series editor for a range of studies on drug trafficking in West Africa. In the past, she has worked for the United Nations peace operations in Guatemala and Burundi, and other international organizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. She was also a special advisor to the Secretary-General of International IDEA. In addition to her organized crime-related work, Camino is currently pursuing a PhD on cyberspace as a domain for strategic competition between states. But I think this is enough for me. I'll now turn to our speakers. First, Professor Ellis, who would provide some introductory remark.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here and for everybody who's come for this occasion. I'm glad that Virginia said that it's notable that there's a new attention for organised crime, which I don't think was there even a couple of years ago. And what I'm going to talk for as short a time as possible, maybe 10 minutes. I think particularly when we're talking about Africa, it's useful to bear in mind a few general points of context, of the times in which we live and of developments over the last few decades. I think the reason that's particularly important with Africa is, I don't know whether or not you agree with me, but so often I think anything that we see or hear or read on Africa tends to be bedeviled by a couple of cliches, and at the risk of being simplistic, one of them is the idea that Africa is always a victim. In other words, we risk, and I think we see it already, reading newspaper articles or even more sophisticated pieces suggesting that Africa has become a victim to organized crime, suggesting that mafias from outside the continent are moving in and are responsible for everything that's going on. Now, there's obviously a grain of truth in that when we look at the role of Latin American crime gangs in West Africa. I mean, it's clear that some influential people have targeted West Africa, but it's of course not true of Africa more generally, and I think we need to bear that in mind. Or indeed the other extreme, which is to suggest that nothing good ever comes out of Africa, that is to say, it's the continent of failed states and so on and so forth, and now to the long list of alleged African deficiencies, we can add organized crime. So in order to try and avoid these rather simplistic either or scenarios, I'm going to try and make a few points about the broader context, and I think Camino who will add some more detailed remarks on West Africa. Well, the first thing I would like to say is I think we've seen over recent years, and I'll say some more about over which recent years exactly, we've seen something of a merging of politics and crime all over the world, not just in regard to Africa, but worldwide. For example, there's an excellent article which I believe was his inaugural lecture as a professor of sociology at the London School of Economics by Stanley Cohen, that was published in about 1997 with the fantastic title Politics and Crime Spot the Difference, published in the British Journal of Sociology. And basically what he's saying as one of certainly one of Britain's leading criminologists, is he's saying we used to think we knew what was crime and what was politics and what was the difference between them, but these days it's getting harder and harder. So this is 17 years or so ago that he published this, and he was thinking particularly of the Balkans. And indeed at that time, for those of you who can cast your minds back to the 1990s, it did seem with some of the operators in the Balkans, it was quite hard to say, well, to what extent are these politicians sort of ruthlessly pursuing what they see as the interests of their constituency, and to what extent are they in fact criminals making use of politics in order to further their financial or other interests. But I don't think, at the time that might have seemed like a particularity of the Balkans, but I think something similar has happened all over the world. Why is that? When does it date from? Well, I think some people would say it's to do with the end of the Cold War and the conditions in which the former Soviet bloc dissolved. But personally, I think you can actually trace the process further back. As with all historical processes, you can kind of go back as far as you want. Every event is, it derives from some other event. But I think the crucial period is really the 1970s. And I would go further, it's not just politics and crime. What we've seen is a merging of legitimate business, illegitimate business, and politics. And the best way of illustrating that or of analyzing it is simply the old adage, follow the money. And the best studies of capital flight indicate that probably if you try and look at the mass of of capital, illegal or illicitly going from one country to another, one jurisdiction to another, most of it probably comes from multinational businesses trying to avoid paying taxes. This has been very publicized recently with major firms, I think the names are known to most of us here, who've been admonished for not paying higher taxes in Britain, and they point out with absolute justification, as far as I can see, they say, no, but we're simply using the law as it is in order to minimize our tax obligations, which all major businesses do. But in the process of doing so, they tend to use the same techniques and the same facilities and sometimes the very same banks as, for example, drug criminals, politicians laundering bribe money or other corrupt proceeds and so on. So the money all merges. But the point I'm making, I suppose, is that in illicit money flows, actually most of it is coming from legitimate business rather than from drug barons and so on. So I think in the particular case of West Africa, let's bear in mind the historical context. Most of West Africa has been independent in the sense of forming sovereign states for about 50 years. As everybody knows, I'm sure, the first West African colonial country to gain independence was Ghana in 1957, and the last one was Guinea-Bissau in 1975. But most countries in the region got their independence in 1960 or thereabouts. That's quite a long time ago now, but it's good to remember that that was preceded by a colonial period, which was really when the rule of law in its modern sense was established. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that before West Africa was colonized that there was absolutely no form of order or anything of that sort, because, of course, all political communities have to have a sense of order and justice in some shape or form. But that's not quite the same as the rule of law in its modern sense. Modern states articulate or promulgate laws in written form, and quite literally in pre-colonial West Africa, this wasn't done simply because, with one or two exceptions, there was no writing. So the idea of having written law codes, obviously, it was a completely different concept of what public order is and what law is. But in the modern sense of written law codes promulgated by a government and indeed enforced by a government through its criminal justice system, that dates from the colonial period. And of course the colonial rule of law, or I should say the rule of law in colonial times, was not really regarded as legitimate by the vast majority of West Africans who may have made some sort of pretense of following the law when they were aware what it was, but they didn't fundamentally regard it as legitimate. And I think if I had more time, I could demonstrate that in all sorts of ways. And allied to that was the practice which the British, particularly in Nigeria, turned into they saw it almost as a virtue, but all colonial governments followed it to some extent or another, more or less openly, sometimes less openly, and that was the practice of indirect rule. In other words, I mean, it's sometimes said that Nigeria, at the height of the colonial period, only had something like 300 or 400 British officers, district officers and provincial officials to administer it, which is a tiny number. So these officials were, in fact, very reliant on local notables, quite often in the case of Nigeria, traditional leaders of some sort, sometimes non-traditional leaders, but people regarded as having local influence, appointed to junior posts in the administration in the expectation that they would carry out the instructions of the European colonial government. And this was known as indirect rule. Well, as a historian who's actually researched these matters, I can tell you, which is, I think, widely accepted, that all sorts of practices which were technically illegal were carried out in the name of indirect rule. In other words, a lot of local officials would pretend to follow the orders of the government or would follow them in certain circumstances, but when the European district officers' back was turned, would do all sorts of things, quite sometimes in conformity with local tradition or local practice, and sometimes far more in the nature of self-serving. But the reason I'm saying that is some informed analysis of so-called organized crime in West Africa points out that quite often you have a relatively weak state, you have parts of a country that may be run by local, let's call them local strongmen, some people might call them warlords, and in effect many states co-opt such people into a system of indirect rule. We've seen this done in a particularly cynical manner, ending rather badly recently in Mali, but it happens all over the place. What I'm trying to point out is that this practice is not new. It has a pedigree going all the way back to the colonial period. A third point I'd like to make is that if you use, I know it's a particularly fraught subject, is to say, you know, what is organized crime? Define organized crime. One author said recently, I was reading something, and he said he's come across 160 definitions, and he's still going, still finding more. So I'm not going to go through 160 definitions, but I'm just going to make the point that most definitions of organized crime, and certainly the one most widely used in the UN system, which is in the Palermo Declaration, I think it's called. Of course, it emphasizes the element of institutionalization, or people doing the same sort of thing repeatedly and having some sort of structure to what they do. Now, if you talk to police officers, whether in West Africa or elsewhere in the world, many of them will point out that most forms of what we might call organized crime in West Africa, the people who do them don't really correspond to the kind of, Hollywood idea of mafias or gangs, these sort of fairly organized corporations with a sort of Marlon Brando figure at the top or something like that. They tend to be much more fluid and ad hoc. So particularly in regard to, for example, the drug trade, law enforcement officers will quite often say, well, you have people who are deeply involved in the drug trade, but they don't really have, in the case of West Africa, you don't really see gangs so much. You see people who may know each other, maybe even be family, they may be from the same home area or something, and they might come together for one particular operation and then go their separate ways, which of course makes it very hard for law officers to investigate them, because you can't do the classic thing as used by, for example, the US police trying to break the mafia families in New York, which is to find a relatively junior or mid-ranking level of a gang, put pressure on them and get them to reveal details of the guys higher up. Because in the case of West Africa, very often there are no gangs, and therefore people operating at a low level, drivers and facilitators of crime, may genuinely not know very much about the operations of the principals, simply because they're not working with them full time. So you have actually the people who commit many crimes are very flexible and non-institutionalized in the way they work. In contrast, if you say, well, what's significant in organized crime is the element of institutionalization or the sufficient organization to repeat the same operation, I'm afraid to say that the main locus of organized crime in many parts of West Africa is the state itself, because of course it has the degree of institutionalization which is necessary to fit into organized crime. This is also not new, and I would commend to you, for those who don't know it, a somewhat neglected work which is by a rather brilliant sociologist, in my view, Stanislav Andreski, who wrote on West Africa in the 1960s, and who I believe invented the word kleptocracy in 1968, I think his book was. And it's not for nothing that he uses the word kleptocracy, because he was working in Nigeria and he was traveling throughout West Africa, and he invented this term to describe the system of government as he saw it at that time, government by theft. And indeed that's literally what it was and what it is. So we're talking about 45 years ago, but I'm emphasizing the historical roots. So to conclude, I suppose that I'm saying there are new things for sure in the world. Don't misunderstand me once again. I'm not saying nothing's changed. It's always been like this. On the contrary, we live in times of rapid change in all sorts of respects, including technological. And one effect of that is that we're seeing an integration of criminal markets worldwide. So somebody who may have been once a principal operator in a relatively small market, let's say producing or selling drugs in one small area, under present circumstances, that person, if they're ambitious and well organized and take the opportunities presented to them, they might be able to turn into a much bigger operator by moving into related markets in different parts of the world, and even using their funds to invest legitimately, which is another story. So I think that's one of the keys to what's happening, and West Africa, of course, is no exception. So particular West African practices of crime, which are deeply embedded historically, have become, in recent years, integrated into worldwide markets and practices. And of course, we're also seeing an erosion of the state system, which was set up historically in the years after 1945, after the creation of the United Nations, the decolonization of the great European colonial empires and so on. That system, now 70-odd years old, is showing its age, hence the fashionable talk of so-called failed states. And then the debate about, well, does organized crime, is it more likely to be in so-called failed states or, on the contrary, to be in developed states? Well, of course, the answer is it's in both. But as I've said, both have particular opportunities to offer to, let's call them political criminal entrepreneurs, because sometimes it's pretty hard to see the difference. Both developed states and less sophisticated states, or states without sophisticated bureaucracies, offer certain advantages, but people who've succeeded in one of these markets are now much better able to move to others thanks to the integration of criminal markets. I will finish there. Thank you for your attention, and pass the word back to our chair.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ellis. I think this was very, very useful for us to better understand the context in which we're going to frame our debate. And now on to Camino for some more specific examples.
Do I need it? Okay, so thank you very much, Virginia, and IISS, and obviously Stephen, for such a wonderful introduction. I'm going to focus more specifically on West Africa, not least because I'm engaged, as Stephen is, in supporting the West Africa Commission on Drugs, and because drug trafficking itself has been elevated to an issue of strategic concern for countries such as the United States as well as the UK, and also because of the impact that the drug trafficking or the flows of drugs from Latin America through West Africa are having supposedly in Europe or on different European countries. Now, the reason why I think it's interesting to look at West Africa, and there I would perhaps add a few points to what Stephen said about the region. Not only has the region inherited the history and the historical structures that he mentioned, but also more recently, many of these countries have gone through serious conflicts. We have still in the region, we have UN peacekeeping operations in Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire. We have AFISMA reheading as a UN mission in Mali. There are three UN political offices: UNOA, the UN office, regional office for West Africa. There is a political office in Guinea-Bissau, and there is a political office in Sierra Leone. The Peace-Building Commission, established, if I recall, back in 2006, has also included drug trafficking on its radar and has a whole agenda of activity in relation to Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, and Liberia in particular, and in coordination with UNOA and UNODC to ensure that these issues receive attention as these countries move forward out of conflict and into a normalized development status. The reason I raise this is because Stephen, prior to us coming here, he was questioning where this insistence on organized crime has come from. In West Africa in particular, it has been on the Security Council agenda since 2008. West Africa in particular has been mentioned in different presidential statements back in 2008, and those have proliferated since then. I think the most recent, obviously, in relation to Guinea-Bissau and Mali in particular. And each of these peacekeeping operations or peace peace offices, the UN peace-building offices, have been requested by the Security Council to regularly update the Security Council on developments related to organized crime and especially drug trafficking. Could you bring up the next slide? The next one. This one. So as part of the work that we're doing for West Africa, I'm sorry that it's not very clear. It's a bit difficult to look at this. What we tried to do was map who is doing what in relation to drug trafficking in particular in West Africa. Now, many of these double as responses to organized crime. So the blue actually refers to UN or international policy or operational responses. The yellow to West Africa responses. The gray to EU, G8, that's not necessary just because of the color, the gray area. But there are also bilateral support there. And then the orange is regional West Africa. So some of these, and what we tried to do was understand, particularly from a development perspective, what specific areas many of these actors are focusing on. And this then comes back to what Stephen was mentioning earlier in relation to the governance challenges, that most of these issues are actually, most of these efforts are focused on the security side, on law enforcement efforts in particular. Very little focus, despite the thrust and the increases in drug trafficking in the region and the actual increases in consumption that have been recorded every year by the UNODC and others. Very little support has gone into the development side of this and focusing on providing support to the region on these issues. And limited support whatsoever has been provided on the actual governance issues. And I think this is one of the major challenges. Most of it is in relation to capacity building a rule of law that is faulty in the first place. Very little assessment of efforts that have actually been conducted, and very little ownership of the response, which is one of the reasons why the West Africa Commission on Drugs came into being to push for a lot more ownership in the region of the responses to date, and also to move away just from the predominantly law enforcement side of the focus to ensure a stronger focus on development and governance. Now, coming back to the governance side, this is something we've been discussing with Stephen and Virginia and a few others. If you could go back to the previous slide. And challenging this issue of the focus mainly on organized crime. And what we've been looking at in West Africa in another study for DFID are the structural issues that nurture organized crime. Mainly those high-level officials that have been implicated in some way or another. So we've been collecting, this is just a snapshot, it's very difficult to read, but one could actually go through every single country and come across some high-level official or somebody related to a high-level official that has been implicated in a drug trafficking case. But we don't want to do this just for the sake of doing it. What we're trying to understand through this mapping of who has been implicated in what and what type of drug-related incident is whether there was an investigation, prosecution, and whether the person was convicted, or whether the person was extradited to a different jurisdiction. And whether in the aftermath of the actual incident, many of which are extremely high level, whether it led to any reforms within a given state. Which then brings me to another piece of work that we're involved in with DFID, and that we have a workshop with DFID tomorrow, which is on this topic, on suggestions for organized crime sensitive programming. Now, it's very difficult for development agencies to involve themselves directly in responding to organized crime, not least because of the issues that Stephen mentioned, that oftentimes, and particularly in the countries that we studied for this piece of work, which were Nepal, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Jamaica, and Guyana, is that across the board corruption and different forms of corruption are prevalent in each of the countries. And it wasn't necessarily organized crime that was the major problem. It's the underlying issues, these underlying dynamics that are the major problem. And pushing forward on some of these issues as a means to respond to organized crime is a highly sensitive political move, which is very difficult, where donors have very little room for maneuver in terms of responding to these issues. But what we did come up with was a framework for going in the back door. In cybercrime, we talk about backdoor entrance points for dealing with different issues. So we adopted that way of looking at the issues, and came across different ways of trying to think about how donors could actually think about organized crime and responding to it through their traditional support. So, thank you. So obviously one of the major problems is do no harm. One of the major things that we've come across is that many of the efforts that have been conducted to date often exacerbate the problem rather than help respond to it. There are different reasons for this, which we can go into afterwards. But 5 of the areas that came out strong across the 6 case studies that we conducted for DFID were the political process, which is put at risk by organized crime, strengthening criminal justice and law enforcement. There's a major problem with how we go about strengthening these areas, and there is a duplication of effort across different bodies. We have development agencies, we have counterterrorism agencies, we have specialized agencies, all trying to support and develop the capacity of law enforcement from different perspectives, not necessarily just from an organized crime perspective. Then the issue of strengthening economic and social development policy. One of the issues that we've come across, and which I mentioned before in relation to West Africa, is that there's very little focus outside of Latin America and the Caribbean on crime-sensitive economic and social development policy. Then engaging civil society and the media. This is often difficult, and even in discussions lately in Accra with NGOs who want to become more engaged in the response, the national response to drug trafficking and other forms of organized crime, including money laundering. they're afraid. First of all, they don't have anchors. There is little support provided by the international community in general to civil society working in these areas, and there are no guarantees, there are no incentives for them to actually engage and take the risks that are inherent in this type of work. And then finally, one of the problems that I think anybody who's working in this area, especially in West Africa, come across is the knowledge base. Baseline data, whether you're looking at the impacts of organized crime on development and the health side of things, whether you're looking at it from a law enforcement perspective or whether you're looking at it from a governance perspective, there's very limited data out there. So these are the 5 areas that we were recommending to DFID, where they could improve, their development work in support of broader organized crime responses. I think I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can actually...
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very, very useful. Thank you both. I think we can now take some questions from the floor. We have about 25 minutes. So I would like to ask everybody who is invited to ask a question to introduce themselves and also state their affiliation. Anyone would like to start? Yeah, sure. Just wait for the microphone to come.
David Page, member of the Institute. I must admit, I do find it amusing that the developed world is actually teaching the developing countries about organised crime, because we're spectacularly not successful at it. Particularly in view of drugs. It is now just as easy to buy drugs in the United Kingdom as it was when I became a policeman in 1980. Why would West Africa, in the particular case here, want to listen to us? What have we actually got to teach them? Because I've seen these charts before, notably from SOCA, not a very successful institution in its own right. What have we got to offer West Africa? A Nigerian contact of mine said the thing that's made him change his mind about organised crime is the arrival of meth labs. Because meth labs have had such an impact so quickly that they've actually changed the local attitude towards organised crime as it's actually dangerous to my family. Not the state, my family. Thank you.
Would you like to
Do you want to group the questions or go straight away?
perhaps we can...
Maybe group 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, sure. The gentleman on the 3rd row, please.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, the former, way back in the days of Customs and Excise before HMRC, I was the organised crime analyst, intelligence analyst, and also the intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet countries, and most of my work since then has been with law enforcement agencies in the ex-Soviet countries. My question deliberately refers to the international input, and that's simply because the size of the potential questions. It's not ignoring the need and the developments within countries, as David rightly pointed on the key issue there, that it's now hitting home domestically. But my question is that how joined up are the international efforts? Particularly, maybe you'd like to comment on the effectiveness of multinational organizations such as the UN and bilaterals, for instance, by large countries of the EU and the US, particularly in relation to the international multilateral efforts. That question is prompted by my study of a proposal. We were deciding whether to bid for this, for bidding for a project, I believe it was World Bank, just over 4 years ago, so early 2009, to modernize the customs service of Guinea-Bissau. And we looked, wait for this, got to get better, folks. We looked at this 70-page document. This was only a few weeks before The president had the army chief killed, and the army retaliated by killing the president. And, of course, you remember at the same time there was the much publicised arrival of Frederick Forsyth in Guinea-Bissau, which was perhaps the most significant development of them all. In that 70-page document, there was not one word, directly or by inference, about the transatlantic drugs trade. And I'm just wondering how far, in letter and in spirit, those multinational agencies have come, and how far they see everything as being connected. I think that follows on from David's opening point about who are we to lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, the gentleman in the first row.
Jonathan Katzenellenberg, and I'm a journalist and member of the Institute. My question, I was just intrigued by the, you say these groups really aren't organised, which, and you can't think of them as having a Tony Soprano figure who heads everything and organises and strategises. I just can't believe that. There's got to be some guy who's fairly clever. You say they're political entrepreneurs. Who are they? Where are they? Well, you know, there must be some names, and you must have better information on their organisation. My second part is that in South Africa, I was wondering to the extent to which organised crime is a problem. I heard some time ago that there are about 50 large organised crime entities. And about 2 years ago, the wife of the former head of intelligence was in fact arrested and prosecuted for drug smuggling. So any insights into that I'd be grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can start with these three first questions. Who would you like to go first?
Well, if I may, I would like to answer a couple of the questions, and I would certainly I don't think I'm very competent to answer the one about the coherence of multinational responses. Camino knows more about this than I do, so if I can answer a couple of them, and then if you could, I mean, obviously you can answer the same ones, but if you could, I'm not going to say anything about that multinational because I just don't know too much about it. What can Britain or anywhere else teach to West Africans on this? I take the point, absolutely. I would say that one of the as far as we know, because it's only still in its early stages, the West African Commission on Drugs, which both Camino and I work for as bureaucrats, I mean as advisors, the Commission members are of course all West Africans from various walks of life. I think I'd be right in saying that the main thrust of the Commission seems to be a little bit in line with what you're saying, to convince West Africans that drugs explicitly is their problem. If I generalize very greatly, I'd say up till now, having researched this issue for quite a long time, whatever people say, in individual interviews, and people try to be nice to me by saying nice things to me, but I've had the impression in all of West Africa that people think, well, the drug trade is not really our problem. I mean, we're traders, we buy these things, we're willing buyers, willing sellers, they're consumed in Europe. All right, it's an illegal trade, but lots of other things are illegal too. So but I think that's changing in the sense that we've seen prominent West Africans, members of the Commission, realizing there's a growing problem of drug consumption in West Africa, and there's a growing problem of political corruption. Political corruption is not new in West Africa, but the amounts of money going into it are colossal and are changing the nature of the political system. And I think there is, among people who think about these things, there is a perception that this is really our problem in West Africa, and therefore we need to look around for advice, best practice, and so on and so forth. But of course, I take the point. On the other one from Mr. Katzenellenberg from South Africa, the point I was trying to make is that, of course, it depends what sort of activity you're looking at. If you're looking at oil bunkering, for example, or indeed the trade in prostitutes from Nigeria to my home city of Amsterdam, these are pretty structured trades for various reasons, partly for technical reasons. If you look at the drug trade, the West African drug trade, I mean, law enforcement officers, West African or otherwise, emphasize time and time and time again that you don't really have cartels. You have people who are in the business and they know other people in the business, and they get together to do operations which might sometimes require several people, and sometimes they might not require several people. But what you don't have is the image that I think many people have, certainly in Britain and no doubt many other parts of the world, which is that when you talk about organised crime, you know, you're talking about, we've all seen the film of The Godfather, you're talking about a very structured, you know, corporations of crime. But that's not really the way it works mostly in Africa. You have a much more ad hoc sort of arrangement. Specifically on South Africa, I'm pleased to talk about this because I've just published a book in South Africa about the history of the ANC during its years in exile. Of course, South Africa, like every other country on earth, has its history of crime. But I think the current crime in South Africa, you have to go back to the 1980s and the circumstances of the struggle in the last years of apartheid and the international context to understand what's happened since 1990 or 1994 in South Africa. To put it bluntly, there are criminals at senior levels of professional criminals and senior levels of the bureaucracy in South Africa and even in government. The most notorious, I'm going to name names, was Joe Modise, who was a Tsotsi from Alexandra, who became head of the ANC's armed wing and ended up as Minister of Defense. But I mean, he was a professional criminal, basically.
Thank you. Camino, would you like to?
Yes, going back to this type of template, I fully agree with you, but this is something that DFID didn't have. In terms of trying to develop, they were trying to develop a format upon which they might be able to support countries that have requested their support to look at organised crime from a development perspective. You mentioned SUCA has done this before. I don't think SUCA and DFID have sat down together and actually done something like this together in terms of responding to requests for support in this area. Another question that comes up in relation to this, why should we be telling them what to do? I think there are certain principles now that we shouldn't be telling countries what to do, but rather when they request support, we should be held responsible for the type of support that we're actually providing. And based on what we've been looking at in West Africa, it hasn't been very effective so far. Is this a problem of coherence between the multilaterals, between specialized agencies, or is it a lack of coherence between different areas of work, law enforcement, social economic development policy, etc.? That is still a question that remains to be answered. I do know on the rule of law field, in the rule of law field in particular, there is a major challenge in terms of conceptual differences, how we approach it, how we approach capacity building, how we approach institutional strengthening across the board, whether we're looking at it from an organised crime perspective or something else. You also asked the question of what we can tell them or what we can teach people or teach countries when we haven't got it very right ourselves. Perhaps it's also a question of learning from other countries and other regions, for example, West Africa. The West Africa Commission on Drugs at the moment is doing some very interesting work on trying to understand the impacts on social development and particularly health. And there I do think there are experiences that can be shared between regions, including, for example, the UK experiences on working with people dependent on drugs in prisons. And this is something that the West African countries are very interested in learning about. And they also have their own lessons that they're trying to also share with others through this West Africa Commission. I think that's about it on that.
Okay, thanks. Would you like to say anything about the effectiveness of joint-up international efforts?
No, I think it's self-explanatory. On this study that we did on West African efforts, the effectiveness, what we did come across was that there are very few mechanisms to actually assess the effectiveness, and that's a major problem. I'm not too sure whether SUCA or other specialized agencies do their own internal evaluations of the actual operations that they conduct in these areas, and how they connect that to a broader regional phenomenon. But what we did come across is that Development agencies don't do it. There's no information out there on any of the efforts that we showed in the other slide on how they are being assessed and what they're being assessed against if they are being assessed. So there's nothing very much out there.
Thanks.
So but maybe
that was the answer. I don't want to sound cynical, but that was the answer I expected.
yeah.
I think most people expect.
Yeah.
The gentleman on the second row.
Thank you, Peter Asprey, member of the Institute. Can you say something more about how bad or why this drugs trade and similar trades is bad for example, West Africa? Can you give examples about how it's bad for them as societies? I mean, because for example, at one level, presumably one of the positives is that it provides lots of money to those communities where they wouldn't have it otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There is a lady at the back.
Brooke Stearns-Lawson with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I was just going to make a comment because I feel like Stephen and Camino fairly punted the response to the coordination effort and say that I'm the transnational organized crime advisor for USAID's Africa Bureau, and the position was created 3 years ago. And I've noticed significant change, or I've been in the position for 3 years. It was created 5 years ago, but I've noticed significant increases in terms of the development communities, engagement and cooperation and coordination, just even in the past 3 years. So I think that part of what happened with the World Bank in Guinea-Bissau is that the development community just simply didn't consider this to be something that was on our agenda or even affected us. And part of what's been happening over the past 3 years with efforts by GIZ, DFID, the World Bank's World Development Report on conflict that included an analysis of crime, and USAID's own analytic work, I think really has been trying to elevate that this is a development problem, and that's the critical and missing first step towards getting the coordination that is definitely still lacking.
Thanks. There was a gentleman there first.
Thanks. I'm Richard Moncrief from the Researcher on Africa in the Foreign Office. I wanted to ask two questions. One is whether the speakers have any insights into criminality in the Sahelian region. I know, Stephen, most of your research recently has been on Nigeria, or at least on Nigerians. And I just wonder if some of the characteristics that you note for West Africa would also be applicable to the Sahelian regions. The other question I wanted to ask is about the scale of this. There's a slight contrast in the sense that, Stephen, you've pointed to a sort of fragmentation of these networks, which I assume must have an impact in terms of how capital is accumulated within them. And if I read you right, what you're saying is that the only points at which these criminal networks take on institutional weight is essentially when they become part and parcel of the state. That's where they take on this institutional weight. And my question is, to what degree criminal money is really fundamentally altering the political dynamics of these countries? In this respect, Guinea-Bissau is quite misleading. Firstly, because if the general idea is right, it's particularly strongly involved in transatlantic drug trade. Secondly, it's the poorest of the poor. I mean, it's incredibly poor. So very little money can have a very strong political impact. You don't need that much money to become a political entrepreneur in Guinea-Bissau. In other countries, that may not be the case. And I just want to know whether you feel, both of you from your research, that the accumulation of drug money within the political system is starting to have a profound influence in the way that oil bunkering has had in Nigeria. And we know there that the money is absolutely vast and is accumulated at the centre in Abuja. We know that, and we know about its impact.
Thanks. We have two more. There's a gentleman over there.
Yes, thank you. I'm Steve Haynes, consultant member of the Institute. I wanted to ask a question about oil, and specifically theft of crude oil in Nigeria. one of Nigeria's problems is it doesn't know how much oil it produces, and therefore it doesn't really know how much of that oil is being stolen. But there are estimates that it might be 1/10 of total annual production. And if that's right, then the sums of money involved would probably dwarf Nigeria's involvement in the drug trade. So it's pretty huge, and it's reasonable to speculate that it is going to involve a degree of organisation, not only in Nigeria itself, but some of this oil must be ending up in more or less legitimate world markets. But nobody really knows much about it, who is involved, how it ends up on world markets. So my question is this: do you know if anyone's sort of taking the lead on trying to find out more about that huge criminal economy?
Thanks. And the last question, the gentleman over there.
David Nodell, apparently the only non-member of the Institute. I work partly in the technology side of anti-money laundering and partly on the policy side of cyber. So I've got two questions. One is, we know that anti-money laundering is basically a dismal failure throughout West Africa and the rest of Africa. So there's no reason why we should expect serious levels of achievement there in dealing with organized crime of any kind. But on the other hand, a lot of the money laundering involved in African crime is either the proceeds of corruption that are being recirculated back into the mainstream banking system, mainly in London, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. And there's also a tremendous amount of money being essentially laundered as a result of different kinds of 419 fraud. So why is the anti-money laundering system in the UK and the rest of Europe and the United States not acting more effectively to counter these areas of criminality? The second area is, you hinted at cyber. How much is known about cyber crime and similar activities in Africa? Obviously, 419 is a form of cyber fraud, but it's a relatively insignificant part. What else is going on, and what is being done about it by local authorities, or for that matter, anyone else?
Well, thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask the speakers to take 3 minutes each to cover some of these questions. Would you like to start first?
Okay, I'll start with the last question on cybercrime. There is quite a lot known about Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon to an extent, generally related to 419 types of crimes, but very little about anything else. There is something that we did come across something in Ghana that was actually quite interesting, that has been noted in Afghanistan and probably a couple of other countries, is the impact of illicit electronic waste dumping. Where one of the major dumps in Ghana has become a hub for dumping electronic waste, both legally and illicitly. And some of the very young, astute entrepreneurs in Ghana go there. They find hard drives, and they then glean information from those hard drives, and have come across very, very interesting information. I can share that with you afterwards if you like. But it's really quite fascinating. It's something that has happened in Afghanistan as well, and very, very sensitive information, including linking to US operations in Iraq and other operations elsewhere has been found on these hard drives. I think there was one case where a Democrat senator from southern US was actually bribed. There was a case of extortion where the young guys in Ghana were actually trying to sell him back his information. It was quite a humorous case, but it's a case that has been actually researched by a group of students, postgraduates in the United States. I can share the information with you if you're interested. One of the things that we did come across in this study for DFID is that development agencies themselves have very little interest in this area. because, under the assumption that it doesn't have a direct impact on the poor. I think that's an erroneous assumption, because obviously the more crime, cyber-related crime in a country, the less interest there is in investing directly in those countries. You have a situation, I live in Abidjan at the moment in Côte d'Ivoire, and it's very difficult to actually carry out transactions electronically. First of all, you don't really want to do that because you've no idea what will happen with your details. But many sites actually block you from conducting a transaction because they're not trustworthy, or the country isn't trustworthy in that regard. Regarding the question on was it criminalization or criminal money entering into the political process? I think one of the challenges, I'll leave this to Stephen to answer in more detail, but one of the questions that the issues that we came across in our research was if you turn it on its head, is the increasing cost of conducting politics in many of these countries appears to be driving some people in political office to engage in criminal activity. The cost of elections, for example, in Ghana is enormous, and it's very difficult to ascertain what the source of this funding, the source of party or campaign funding is. There are regulations and there is a proper regulatory framework for campaign financing, political party funding, etc. But it's very rarely implemented or monitored. So that is something that we've suggested to DFID, for example, would be useful to monitor. But whether DFID can do anything else beyond that is a totally different question. In relation to the impact of organized crime, it depends which type of organized criminal activity. As I mentioned, there are impacts from illicit e-waste dumping. There's also the manifold impacts of drug trafficking. I think one of the major issues that that does require serious attention in West Africa in particular is the consumption issue. There is a registered increase in consumption of hard drugs, heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamines, etc. And the actual capacity, it's not so much there is a capacity issue, but the lack of focus on these issues, not only from the West Africans who many countries actually do want to respond to the issue, but the lack of resources, and then the lack of interest also from their international partners is a major problem. Then obviously all the governance challenges, that's just two examples of organized crime. Stephen?
Okay, well there's a lot there, but let me try and go through as quickly as I can and start off by saying, for obvious reasons, first of all, we lack almost any sort of reliable statistics on organised crime in West Africa. I mean, you do get odd figures here and there. You know, if there's a big drug seizure or something, you can at least say, well, that appears to be a fact. But any sort of aggregate figures, I mean, you can't really believe them, even if you ever come across them. And indeed, the actual mechanics, as I suppose is often the case with crime, the actual mechanics of how given groups of people or individuals work is also very difficult to know, because the only people who know for sure are people who are involved in the criminal business themselves, and they're most unlikely to tell you. But if, in answer to the question about the Sahel, well, I think now a lot is known about what's been going on for the last 10 years in northern Mali in particular. Now, that's not necessarily typical of the Sahel, in the sense that northern Mali is a zone where almost everybody has to live one way or another close to smuggling. I mean, what else are you going to do in that area? There used to be a tourist trade there, but that died out quite a few years ago for obvious reasons. So, and in fact, in the local Arabic, the word for long-distance commerce, which is usually illicit, is al-frud, from the French fraude. That's the word for commerce. People are aware that this is illegal, but they don't regard it as illicit. I'm not talking specifically about the drug trade. A lot of it, the only time I visited northern Mali was about 9 years ago, and at that time a lot of the stuff was simply moving things, basic products like tomato paste, sugar, consumer supplies from Algeria, where they were subsidized, to northern Mali, where you could sell them for a slightly higher price and benefit from the Algerian subsidy, which technically was al-Frud, but everybody, you know, that's what people lived on. And then cigarette smuggling, and I myself came across groups of cigarette smugglers in the Sahara. That was, you know, the staple at the time, but obviously people subsequently moved into hostage taking and then drugs. And it's now fairly well understood how the reaction at the time of the central state in Mali was they couldn't really control northern Mali anyway. So the president of the time more or less licensed these activities. In other words, this indirect rule that I'm talking about. And of course, the smugglers were paying off various people, including the people close to the president, but also paying off various other people. But still, the profits of that trade are so great that you can still make profits, even though you have to pay off various people. And that's pretty typical of the Sahara. Now, the extent to which that happens further south in the Sahel, in places like Burkina Faso, I really don't know. But it's much less of a zone of transit than Mali. It's got a much more settled population, and therefore I would imagine that it's considerably less than in the northern Sahel or the Sahara. The political effects, I think, are important. I must say, when I started looking into this area in detail, I was trying to find examples of saying, a bit like the gentleman asked, saying, well, if drug trading, it may not be good, but if it's bringing money into the area, couldn't it possibly be a motor for development? I mean, maybe somebody's using this money to invest in something productive. But this doesn't really seem to be the case. In every case that I've inquired into, and I'd be very interested if somebody's got a counter evidence, people who've made money in the drug trade in West Africa seem to use it to buy big properties, both in West Africa and abroad, in the United States, in France, in Spain and elsewhere, to buy big cars, preferably Hummers, and, you know, generally just to sort of squander it. Or as George Best once said, I spent 9/10 of the money on wine, women and fast cars, and the rest I just squandered. I mean, that seems to be the general attitude to drug money. It's hot money, literally, so, you know, it's easy come, easy go. What it does do is enormously increase the price of real estate in the big cities. And anybody who goes to West Africa, you see these huge areas in Dakar, Lagos, Accra, you know, just you name any big city, and everybody says, you know, this is drug money. There was even a district in Gao, of all places, called Cocaine Bugu, the cocaine suburb. That's what people call it, because they know that the money there has come from the cocaine business. It drives up prices generally. It drives up the price of real estate. It's not a big employer. The people at the top end, of course, make a lot of money, but it doesn't employ large numbers of people, and many of those who are employed in the drug trade at low levels obviously don't get paid very much. At the moment, it appears that in many countries, as I think the chart here graphically demonstrates, very senior political figures or very senior figures in the administration have interests in the drug trade. At the very least, they take bribes from drug traders. This is dangerous because, of course, it means that the drug lobby has a serious input into governance. And this is in countries where I don't think anywhere, as far as I know, nowhere in West Africa has a really effective system of domestic taxation, whether on businesses or on individuals. During a recent trip to Ghana, I had a very interesting conversation with the gentleman who runs the computer system for Ghana's equivalent of the Inland Revenue. And it was very, very interesting to see, you know, Ghana seems to be a country where they could be on the verge of a breakthrough to actually taxing large numbers of people. Now, whether people will accept that is a different question, but I mean, technically, it has the means to do it. But many West African countries simply don't really tax the general population, and they make no effort to do so. They live on money gained from external sources, and of course, that's one of the reasons why the drug trade is so terribly attractive. So if you're not careful, you will increase the tendency to, as it were, political extroversion, that is to say, a political elite which looks not to its own constituency, its own population, but looks outwards for the means to perpetuate its own existence and to make the money that they need to just satisfy enough members of their own patronage system or so on to keep them happy. But that's quite opposite from the way that modern states are supposed to work. And I think the final point is, as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet, but you could get something where, you know, drugs become both consumed and distributed by urban gangs, rather like you have in the United States. You can kind of see signs of that in Freetown in Sierra Leone, which has a long history of urban gangs. And I was there last year with somebody who's in this audience, and there certainly was evidence of crack and other sorts of hard drugs in circulation, but I couldn't really see evidence that it had become, like a sort of, like a ghetto in some American city where some people just, live on the drug trade both by consuming and selling. So that's for the political effect. I think the political effects are bad. Then the question about oil, I don't know, but I'm always looking for a serious study of what happens to all this smuggled oil from Nigeria. There's plenty of studies of these sort of, guys in the Niger Delta who do this sort of artisanal tapping when they make a hole in a pipe and so on. But the really serious oil bunkering is organised at the highest level of the state. And it clearly involves oil companies, the Nigerian state itself, up to the very highest level, oil companies, of various sorts, shippers and major oil traders. And there must be plenty of people in the oil business who know exactly how it works, but they don't tell me. And if that's the case, I suspect it's because, it's a source of relatively cheap oil, and nobody in the oil business is going to willingly give the information which will close down that particular trade. And the same, of course, goes through for money laundering. I've literally spoken to law enforcement officers in the United States, but I'm sure that the same would be true. It's not just America, the same would be true of other countries, who said, look, we try and stop people from laundering drug money here, but we have colleagues in other departments, such as the Department of the Treasury, who are trying to get as much money into the United States as possible. So you've got, one hand doing one thing and the other hand doing something else. And after all, the ultimate aim of most drug laundering, of most money laundering, I should say, is not just to get your money into the Cayman Islands or somewhere, it's to get it into New York or London, or these days Singapore or Hong Kong. And we had an interesting, what would you call it, lecture or kind of presentation by a West African expert, Camino and I, last time we were in West Africa together, who was explaining about the amount of physical money laundering going out of Nigeria. I think I'm right in saying, he said they detected $1 billion in a 6-month period. If physical money, in other words, it's not going in bank transfers, it's guys carrying it in suitcases, or in some spectacular cases, taped to their own bodies, going to Dubai. So there's a huge money laundering which doesn't even go through banks, but is physically taken to, Dubai in this case. That seems to be a big centre.
The direct flights now.
Direct flights, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Camino, you wanted to add one final point.
Just one final point. Stephen, I do have a case, the case of Amoateng, who was investing the money of his heroin trade back into the community. It's an interesting case. It's the first one up here. And a member of parliament in Ghana who had been trafficking heroin to the United States in ceramics. A minister, I think it was the Minister of Energy, had established a foundation, a charitable foundation through which they were laundering the proceeds of the drug exploit. What was interesting in this case, and I went to the community last year, is that the community actually demonstrated against his incarceration in the United States. They were very angry, and he had been investing in schools, in getting young people, paying for their trips down to Kumasi, the next town, so they could register as voters. He was also supplying tractors so that they could plow their fields, etc. So when he was detained in the United States, there was a major uproar in the town. There's now a road named after him in the village, which is very interesting. And he will be released from prison next year. And I'm sure that if he runs for office again, he will win. So this is an interesting anecdote, but it's one of the very few cases that we've come across. Which brings me to this actual database that we've been developing. It's actually a very useful tool to understand the type of organizations that are operating in West Africa. Sorry, one of the things that that are very difficult to come by are trial transcripts, but we've been collecting them, and they're a really wonderful source of information. There's a fantastic one from Sierra Leone, from a big cocaine case from 2008. There are several cases, access to trial transcripts in the US is pretty easy once you find your way through the system. Then also in Ghana, there have been several administrative proceedings regarding high-level officials implicated in different types of drug trafficking. And so trying to understand, or reading those and trying to understand the cracks in the system that allowed this activity to take place is actually an interesting step forward.
I just wanted to mention something that wasn't specifically raised, but one of the things that's very interesting, I mean, like I said before, the West African Commission on Drugs is very much in its early stages, but one of the things that's interesting to date, and I assume that these ideas will be developed, but I can't predict for sure, but is that the Commission seemed almost to be shocked, although some of these are very senior people, ex-heads of state and ex-ministers and so on, some of them seem to be shocked to realise that there is a problem of drug consumption in West Africa, and that there's almost no treatment available. And I think they've realised this, and so they're asking for examples of best practices for dealing with people who've got a problem with drugs or heavy drug consumers or something like that. And allied to that, of course, is many of them, in as much as they have a policy at all, it's simply if you find a drug user, and inevitably we're talking about very small users, you throw them into prison. So we had President Obasanjo, who, as many of you know, was a political prisoner in the 1990s, saying when he was he claims he became sort of awakened to this because when he was in prison he found that a lot of the other people in there with him were simply small-time drug users who'd been arrested and left to rot because they didn't have enough money to get their way out of prison. So if it leads to a change in the way drug users are regarded, and indeed the treatment available, then I think it will have already done something very useful. And of course it might help then with tackling the really big and difficult issue, which is what on earth do you do about large-scale drug trading?
Yeah. Thanks. Well, thank you very much. I think you will all agree with me that today we had a very productive and fascinating section. Normally, as soon as the hour is up, everybody runs out of the room. I can see we overrun by 15 minutes and everybody's still sitting down, and I think we could carry on very, very easily. So that's a good sign. It also tells me that we should do more events and more research on these issues. So thank you very much for your interaction, and please join me in thanking the speakers. Thank you.